First of all, I'd like to thank the Desmond Greaves Summer School for inviting me to chair this session, in particular because I'm extremely honoured to be asked to chair a session where Vanessa is the speaker. For those of you who don't know, I'm the chair of the Peace and Neutrality Alliance. We were founded 21 years ago, and the purpose of the organisation is to build a broad-based alliance to advocate Irish neutrality, Irish independence and Irish democracy, because we felt at the time, that's 21 years ago, don't forget, I think a guy called Ahern or something like that was calling for a referendum on the Partnership for Peace, and he somehow forgot that when he got into power. So we predicted, and we were founded because we believed Ireland was going to become integrated into the US, EU, NATO military structures. And of course, as all of you now know, Ireland is a US aircraft carrier that is and of course the 6 counties of Northern Ireland has long been occupied by the British Empire and a member of NATO since its foundation. So the whole country now is totally integrated into the US, EU, NATO military structures and their doctrine of perpetual war. The latest, for example, was Operation Sophia, where in fact it's a major process by integrating the Irish army into an emerging EU army, navy. Sorry, so that's all happening now as we speak. But of course, all this has got to do with the Ireland's integration into perpetual war, and the war in Syria is, of course, just one of many wars. PANA, what we try and do is produce pamphlets like this. I've left some of them around. They're for free, but if you want to give me a donation, I can handle that. We commissioned Red Sea Poll in 2013 to ask the Irish people their views on the Syrian war. 78% said Ireland should be neutral. 67% Ireland and the EU should not send arms and military supplies to the anti-government groups in Syria. 61% said the Irish troops should not be sent to Syria. That is, there was talk at the time of sending troops as peacekeeping forces. And 79% said Ireland should not support war on Syria, certainly without a UN mandate. So that is like exactly the position that PANA adopted, and the exact opposite to what our government did by continuing to be a US aircraft carrier and supporting the government. As did, of course, all the other vassal states of the American Empire: Israel, Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, and so on and so forth. So Vanessa is a writer, a photographer, a peace activist, an investigative journalist. Originally worked in corporate marketing, but since 2012 she has spent much of her time in the Middle East and in Gaza during the Israeli offensive Operation Pillar of Defence, and went back to Gaza until recently when she returned to France. She launched a Facebook page, The Wall Will Fall, which gives her view on what's happening in Syria and the Middle East. And she writes for media such as the 21st Wire, I hope I got the pronunciation right, the Al Mayadeen, which is a Lebanon TV station, Counterpunch, RT, and other stations. So, without further ado, I introduce you now to Vanessa.
Thank you, and I'd like to obviously extend my gratitude for my invitation to this outstanding event. It's really an honour and a privilege for me to be invited and to be here among you. Tony asked me to cover the subject with a very broad brush. I struggle with that, I have to say, because my job is very much to go to Syria and actually investigate the detail on the ground in order to counter what I consider to be nothing more than media, PR and publicity for the various EU, UK, US state foreign policy. So I've done my best tonight to sort of try and give you a broader picture, but I have at one point zeroed in on one particular story that I investigated very recently in East Aleppo, liberated East Aleppo since December 2016, in order to just give you a glimpse of how, in my opinion again, the Western media, the corporate media, is distorting, misinforming and misdirecting the narrative on Syria that has effectively perpetuated the conflict, maintained the conflict inside Syria. As we've seen, of course, previously in Iraq, in Libya, in Ukraine more recently, in South America, etc. The list is pretty long. But what I want to do is to discuss a little of the background of Washington's long war on Syria. This is actually a book that was written by Stephen Gowans, fairly recently, published fairly recently, and I would recommend everybody read it because it gives probably one of the most comprehensive backgrounds on the war against Syria and detail on the political system inside Syria under both Assads, Hafez al-Assad and his son Bashar al-Assad. The war started a long time ago, but back after independence from France in 1946, and has continued to this day with the current war in Syria that began in 2011 and has had devastating consequences for the Syrian people. I'm going to look at the evolution of that war since Russia's involvement in September 2015 at the request of the internationally recognized Syrian government. That dramatic turn of events and subsequent uprooting of international terrorism from Syrian territory has resulted in what we've seen is a ferocious new Cold War rhetoric from Western governments and aligned corporate media. This rhetoric has been ratcheted up in parallel with the military and diplomatic success of Russian intervention in Syria and the derailing of the NATO state, Gulf state, and Israeli ambitions to destabilize Syria and force regime change upon yet another sovereign nation. Author William Blum highlighted this US obsession with the Russian threat in the introduction to his book, Rogue State. Quote, "For more than 70 years, the United States convinced much of the world that there was an international conspiracy out there, an international communist conspiracy seeking no less than control over the entire planet for purposes which has no socially redeeming values. And the world was made to believe that it somehow needed the United States to save it from this communist darkness. Just buy our weapons, said Washington. Let our military and our corporations roam freely across your land and give us veto power over who your leaders will be, and we will protect you." Unquote. The war in Syria has lasted almost 7 years with an estimated 400,000 deaths, the majority of whom are Syrian Arab army, contrary to reports from the compromised media who would have us believe that these are all civilian deaths at the hands of President Assad personally. What is happening in Syria is not a civil war. It is the continuation of decades of external intervention in Syria's sovereign affairs with a variety of proxy actors. It is a dirty war on Syria, the book by Professor Tim Anderson published 2 or 3 years ago that again investigates in depth the various false narratives that have been produced against Syria, or as I said, Washington's long war on Syria by Stephen Gowans. Last year was the 100 years since the conclusion of a secret deal between Britain and France that was destined to plunge the Middle East into turmoil, bloodshed, and chaos for decades. Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot carved up the Middle East between their respective countries, basically to protect European colonial interests as the Ottoman Empire began to crumble at the end of the First World War. Promises of self-determination made by the British contingent to secure Arab help in defeating the Turkish occupation were dismissed once objectives were secured. And in fact, as John Hillary, executive director of War and once said, instead of national liberation, there would just be a changing of the imperial guard. The plan was brutally simple. Britain and France would divide the Middle East in two, with little or no regard for the wishes of the peoples and the factions that would be divided by this line. The line that went from Accra on the Mediterranean coast to Kirkuk in northern Iraq. Everything to the north came under French control, everything to the south under British control. France acquired Syria and Lebanon, while Britain got its claws into Iraq and Transjordan. The Sykes-Picot Agreement left Palestine unclaimed, and this was resolved by the British cozying up to leading figures in the emerging Zionist movement in order to secure international support for the British control of Palestine. This strategy concluded with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, whose anniversary is this year, which effectively gave British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and opened the floodgates for the brutal ethnic cleansing, occupation, and rape of Palestine by waves of European settler Zionists. The Balfour Declaration denied the rights of Palestinians to self-determination in their own nation, with one flourish of the pen, and has continued to this day. Palestinian humiliation was further compounded by their exclusion from the Anglo-French Declaration of November 1918, which guaranteed, quote, the complete and final liberation of the peoples who have for so long been oppressed by the Turks, and the setting up of national governments and administrations that shall derive their authority from the free exercise of the initiative and choice of the indigenous populations. Palestine was deliberately excluded from this agreement. The discovery of oil in Iraq in the late 1920s made Palestine all the more crucial an acquisition for Britain. With France in control of the northern oil route to the Lebanese seaports, Britain needed to connect pipelines from the Iraqi oil fields to the Palestinian port of Haifa to give them a Mediterranean oil route that would bypass French control. Britain's energy resource needs came first over the needs of the people of Palestine and ensured Britain's permanent interest and ongoing intervention in the Middle East. As John Hillary, again, Executive Director of WARN, once said, in the Middle East, the Sykes-Picot Agreement cast its shadow over more than just Palestine, as shown by the bloody histories of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon up to the present day. French rule in Syria and Lebanon finally came to an end in 1946, but neither pan-Arab nationalism nor Baathism were able to overcome the Sykes-Picot legacy until perhaps now. The plunging of the Middle East into chaos and the redrawing projects did not end there. Moving forward to 2006, US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice coined the term the New Middle East in Tel Aviv. This is covered by Mahdi Darius Nazamoraya in his analysis, Plans for Redrawing the Middle East, the Project for a New Middle East. Quote, this announcement was a confirmation of an Anglo-American Israeli military roadmap in the Middle East. This project, which has been in the planning stages for several years, consists in creating an arc of instability, chaos, and violence extending from Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria to Iraq, the Persian Gulf, Iran, and the borders of NATO-garrisoned Afghanistan, unquote. I will now provide a dateline of the significant instances of US deep state intervention in Syria and events that led us to the current conflict and the US coalition's most recent and so far failed attempt at regime change. I apologize, the writing is very small, but I'm going to run through the events. But it gives you an indication of quite how much meddling has been done by the United States coalition inside Syria since its independence from French colonization in 1946. In 1956, there was a CIA plot to overthrow the Syrian government, which involved the assassination of major or eminent military officers. In 1982, there was a CIA plot to destabilize Syria and remove the Ba'athist government under former President Hafez al-Assad. And this led to the much exploited narrative of the Hama massacre, which is much used by the Muslim Brotherhood these days to demonize the Syrian government. The figures of the massacre, of the actual Hama massacre, were hugely exaggerated. Figures from on the ground have reduced the figures of I think, between 20 and 30,000 down to 2,000, as little as 2,000. And what is never mentioned also in Western media is the campaign of violence that led up to that crackdown by Hafez al-Assad against the Muslim Brotherhood fanatics, who leading up to that had been carrying out suicide bomb attacks, civilian massacres, and attacks on the Syrian army. 1983, a CIA document, redacted document, was released revealing a project to destabilize Syria to enable the Qatar-Turkey oil pipeline. In 1986, further CIA documents outlining plans to involve the Muslim Brotherhood construct in a manufactured civil war fueled by externally imposed sectarian narrative. In 2005, Christiane Amanpour of CNN interviewed Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and during this interview, Amanpour clearly alludes to the US project to secure regime change in Syria. 2005 to 7, US funded opposition leaders within Syria, the US funded opposition leaders within Syria to defeat President Assad in 2007 elections. The US and the UK have traditionally funded and hosted Muslim Brotherhood groups inside Syria and in the US and in the UK. In 2006, there was a US State Department cable released via WikiLeaks in which there was a discussion of their regime change strategy. In 2007, US General Wesley Clark publicly exposed US deep state plans to take out 7 countries in 5 years. Quote, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran." 2009, US and UK established a multi-million funded TV satellite channel, Barada TV, to broadcast anti-Assad propaganda throughout Syria. 2009, Saudi Arabia warned publicly of the Shiite crescent, Iraq, Syria, Iran, Hezbollah and Lebanon becoming, in their words, a full moon, and they committed themselves to the overthrow of the Syrian government via any means possible. In 2009, a leaked US Department memo stating that Saudi Arabia is the #1 global source of funding for terrorism. In 2011, US, UK and Turkey special ops personnel were sent inside Syria to train the moderate rebels, in inverted commas. 2011, weapons poured into Syria via Libya, Turkey and Jordan. There was a report at the time in New York Times that weapons were shipped from Libya to Syria after Gaddafi's murder and NATO's intervention that ensured the reduction of Libya to a failed state. 2012, the CIA and Obama set up their $500 million train and equip program in Syria to arm and train the alleged moderate opposition. In 2013, former French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas informed us that the British had been preparing a rebel invasion of Syria at least 2 years before the start of the armed uprisings. This story has been corroborated by my interviews also with Syrian nationals living inside France who attended the early meetings in France and were horrified. Often their exclusion from those meetings if they would discern to be pro-Syrian government, and the fact that basically even within France this so-called revolution was being fomented 1 or 2 years before it actually erupted inside Syria. In 2016, Robert F. Kennedy wrote his landmark article for Politico, "Why the Arabs Don't Want Us in Syria," in which he said, quote, "They don't hate our freedoms, they hate that we have betrayed our ideals in their own countries for oil." The CIA began its active meddling in Syria in 1949, barely a year after the agency's creation. Long before our 2003 occupation of Iraq triggered the Sunni uprising that has now morphed into Islamic State, the CIA had nurtured violent jihadism as a Cold War weapon and freighted US-Syrian relationships with toxic baggage, unquote. As Stephen Gowans tells us in the introduction of his book, The Long War on Syria, quote, "The United States' efforts to oust the government of Bashar al-Assad antedated the Arab Spring by many years, and Washington had a hand in inciting the Muslim Brotherhood, which had a long history of violent antagonism towards the Syrian government dating back to 1963. Washington's motivations to topple Bashar al-Assad's government prior to 2011 were related to Damascus's embrace of an anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist position and its program of state-directed economic development," unquote. Arab nationalism, the core ideology of Hafez and Bashar al-Assad, threatened imperialism and, most importantly, the oil wealth monopoly ruled over by the US-UK client state, the House of Saud, an absolute monarchy with one of the worst human rights violations records in the world today. Quote again from Stephen Gowans. Arab nationalism was a vision that Washington would not allow to grip the imagination of the world's 400 million Arabs. The US accordingly embarked on a decades-long campaign of invasions and economic warfare to drive Iraq's experiment in Arab nationalism into ruin and eventually to purge the state of its secular Arab nationalist influence, de-Baathification. Wall Street's war on Syria was motivated by exactly the same aim, the de-Baathification of Syria and the elimination of secular Arab nationalist influence from the Syrian state as a means of expurging the Arab nationalist threat to US hegemony on a global level, unquote. While I'm speaking now, I'm just going to play you a very recent video that was taken by Rupley TV of the effects of the US coalition bombing in Raqqa. Raqqa has been reduced, as Mosul has been, to what is effectively a moonscape. It's been pulverized. Harold Pinter, during his 2005 acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize, spoke of the UK-US-led war against Iraq. The invasion of Iraq was a bandit act, an act of blatant state terrorism, demonstrating absolute contempt for the concept of international law. The invasion was an arbitrary military action inspired by a series of lies upon lies and gross manipulation of the media and therefore of the public. An act intended to consolidate American military and economic control of the Middle East, masquerading as a last resort, all other justifications having failed to justify themselves, as a liberation. A formidable assertion of military force responsible for the death and mutilation of thousands and thousands of innocent people. We have brought torture, cluster bombs, depleted uranium, innumerable acts of random murder, misery, degradation, and death to the Iraqi people, and we call it bringing freedom and democracy to the Middle East, unquote. In Iraq and in Syria, the US coalition has waged a brutal hybrid war, in Iraq leading to the starvation of 500,000 children, described by Madeleine Albright, while Bill Clinton's UN representative, as a price that was worth it. We could just as easily apply Pinter's prophetic speech to the US coalition intervention inside Syria. As Dr. Bashar Jafri, the permanent Syrian representative to the UN in New York, stated in January 2016, "23 million Syrians are being besieged by the international community in the form of economic sanctions and the restriction on travel, not to mention the invasion of their country by international terrorism. In Syria, sanctions have again been used as a tenderizing tool, with the resulting collective punishment not of the named individuals or targeted entities, but of the entire Syrian population. This is nothing less than economic terrorism designed to undermine, weaken, and discredit the target state or government. There are people inside Syria that are unable to get treatment for chronic illnesses like cancer, like in need of kidney dialysis, because that equipment in the hospitals that are serving these people are unable to replace equipment or to repair equipment. Just one example. Thanks to Syria's allies, Russia, Lebanon, China, and Iran, it has largely failed, but not without severe and horrific side effects for the Syrian people, besieged externally by the US-EU sanctions, and internally by a variety of occupation and sieges carried out by the US coalition extremist and terrorist factions, including Nusra Front, aka Al-Qaeda in Syria. In Syria, we've seen the deployment of the soft or the smart power complex on an unprecedented scale in lockstep with the funding, arming, and promotion of a multitude of extremist or terrorist proxies, many of whom are foreign mercenaries. This war has been underpinned by the NGO complex, the non-governmental organization complex, the NATO-aligned and Gulf media, a variety of government-sponsored think tanks, and even international institutions like the UN. As Admiral Sir Philip Jones, Britain's first Sea Lord, said very recently, the hard punch of military power is often delivered inside the kid glove of humanitarian relief. I will now come to the second part of my presentation, in which I will focus in a little more detail on the actual conflict in Syria, with particular reference to Aleppo, where I spent considerable time during the battles for its liberation from Nusra Front-dominated terrorist occupation. In August 2016, I was first there during the liberation itself in December 2016, and later in April and May and July and August of this year. Probably one of the most persistent narratives promulgated by the compromised media in the West is that of the Syrian government's brutal crackdown on the peaceful protesters. This misleading narrative has been dismissed by the Syrian people inside Syria, who witnessed and were affected by these so-called peaceful protests. These include, for example, Father Franz van der Lucht, who had been living peacefully in Syria for almost 50 years, and who was murdered by NATO state-funded militants in Homs on the 7th of April 2014 for having resisted the NATO-aligned peaceful protester narrative with his own witness testimony. Quote, "From the start, the protest movements were not purely peaceful. From the start, I saw armed demonstrators marching along in the protests who began to shoot at the police first. Very often, the violence of the security forces has been a reaction to the brutal violence of the armed so-called rebels." January 2012. Legislative Decree number 54, regulating the right to peaceful demonstration, the 21st of April 2011. President al-Assad issued this decree number 54, regulating the right to peaceful demonstration, as early as April 2011. Peaceful demonstration being described as one of the basic human rights guaranteed by the Syrian constitution. Article 9 states, no one, and this includes the security forces and the Syrian army and the police forces, no one is allowed to carry a weapon during the demonstrations, even if he has a license. B, according to the legislative decree, sharp or piercing instruments or any instruments which threaten the safety of citizens are to be considered a weapon. There are endless archives of interviews with security forces and civilians that will testify to the fact that the greatest number of casualties and deaths were among the actual security forces in the first 6 months of the so-called peaceful uprising. Quote from a Syrian national living in Australia, "Police officers who attended the protests on duty were not armed, and as there was no brutal crackdown on demonstrations. Snipers on rooftops were seen working as Saudi-funded mercenaries, shot into the crowds of civilians and police officers to foment the sectarian violence. More army, police and security members died than civilians in the first 6 months. This is fact and has been extensively documented and reported," unquote. Ava Bartlett, a dear colleague and independent journalist who has herself visited Syria many times, wrote in her report entitled Deconstructing the NATO Narrative on Syria, quote, "The April 10th, 2011 murder of Banyas farmer Nidal Janud was one of the first horrific murders of Syrian civilians by so-called unarmed protesters. His face gashed open, mutilated and bleeding, Janud was paraded by an armed mob who then publicly hacked him to death." Al Jazeera journalist Ali Hasham resigned from Al Jazeera because they refused to show his May 2011 video footage of armed fighters entering Syria from Lebanon. Al Jazeera actually told Hasham to forget there are any armed men in Syria. East Aleppo was actually invaded by these armed men in 2012-13. These NATO-backed militant and extremist groups, under various brand names, entered the district of the eastern sector of the city, and this was gradually taken over by force. 600,000 civilians at that point fled East Aleppo for the safety of West Aleppo, that was still under Syrian government control and remained so for the almost 5 years that East Aleppo was under terrorist occupation. As I wrote in my two-part Aleppo series for Mint Press in September 2016, quote, "Aleppo became synonymous with destruction and Syrian state-generated violence among those whose perception of the situation in the war-torn nation is contained within the prism of mainstream media narratives. The NATO-aligned media maintained a tight grip on information coming out of this beleaguered city, ensuring that whatever news did escape was tailored to meet State Department requirements and advocacy for regime change. The propaganda mill churned out familiar tales of chemical weapons, siege, starvation, bombs targeting civilians, all of which were attributed to the Syrian government and military, with very little variation on these themes. In these two articles that I wrote for Mint Press, I dismantle the narratives that have maintained the regime change war against Syria and Aleppo and throughout Syria, including the moderate rebel myth, which is wrapped up in the Free Syrian Army branding. Quote, "There are also various offshoots of the Free Syrian Army, the US armed and funded so-called moderate opposition group that was trained by the CIA, which relies entirely upon Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, in Syria to bolster its arms and logistic capabilities. Nusra Front made up 80% of the terrorists on the ground in eastern Aleppo. The group announced various rebranding campaigns in which it changed its name to the Front for the Conquest of Sham, or Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, and more recently to Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS as you will often read, and has made outward attempts to distance itself from Al-Qaeda. It has, however, made no changes to its leadership or to its extremist, elitist ideology." Unquote. The moderate rebel myth has now been pretty much universally consigned to the propaganda chamber, even among state-aligned media in the US. At the beginning of this presentation, I talked about the unprecedented multi-spectrum hybrid war that is being waged against Syria. The Aleppo black box exposed this apparatus as an emperor with no clothes. The liberation of Aleppo destroyed the firewall that had been erected by corporate media in the West, the NATO-aligned NGOs, and multitude of neoconservative think tanks and institutes to withhold information from the public. Information that may well have ended this brutal war much sooner had it been reported upon by the Western media in its entirety. In his article, War by Media and the Triumph of Propaganda, John Pilger states, quote, "In 2003, I filmed an interview in Washington with Charles Lewis, the distinguished American investigative journalist. We discussed the invasion of Iraq a few months earlier, and I asked him, what if the freest media in the world had seriously challenged George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld and had investigated their claims, instead of channeling what turned out to be crude propaganda? He replied that if we journalists had done our job, there is a very, very good chance we would not ever have gone to war in Iraq." Unquote. Few other countries have endured such an intense 6 years of hysterical, dramatic, perception-nudging, headline-dependent media coverage as Syria. What I hope to demonstrate to you today is how corporate media in the West has distorted reporting on Syria to the extent where, as I said, they have perpetuated the conflict and prolonged the suffering of the Syrian people, while denying the creation of a peace process, of resolution of this conflict by the Syrian people among themselves. They have promoted the terrorist and extremist factions, funded and armed by the US and Gulf state coalition. The majority of mainstream media have been basing their narrative on sources inside Syria that have a clear and undeniable link to the extremist groups, particularly Al-Qaeda, and very few people have been on the ground in Syria at pivotal points in the conflict, such as the liberation of East Aleppo. Very few NATO state war efforts or illegal interventions have had such a veneer of humanitarian pretext applied to its rapacious subtext. And few NATO state humanitarian pretexts have had such a glamorous knight in shining armour as the white helmets to propel their narrative into the upper echelons of the media and not-for-profit industrial complex. I'm limited on time during this presentation to cover the background, genesis and evolution of this Al-Qaeda affiliated group, embedded exclusively in the dwindling areas of Syria occupied by Nusra Front and ISIS, accompanied by a multitude of splinter groups and factions rebranded but still adhering to the extremist Islamic ideology and carrying out ethnic cleansing pogroms against Syria's minorities and the recalcitrant citizens who refuse to abandon their secular state for a brutal, racist, elitist and extremist Islamic state, or even a so-called moderate Muslim Brotherhood Islamic state. It must also be noted that the White Helmets are a multi-million-dollar funded organization by the same governments who have a publicly declared vested interest in regime change in Syria. The same governments who are funding, arming, equipping and promoting the terrorist and extremist factions inside Syria, including Al-Qaeda. However, what I will do is show one video interview I did in April 2017 with residents of Bab al-Nadab, one of the East Aleppo districts. In this district, the White Helmets shared headquarters with Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, but according to civilians who had lived through the 4.5-year siege, it was not all they shared. We don't have sound, so I hope you can all read the subtitles. Basically, this was a kindergarten school that had been taken over by Nusra Front. Nusra Front actually occupied around 300 of the 500 schools inside East Aleppo. Equally, they occupied the majority of the hospitals and used them as military centres, Sharia courts, prisons, torture chambers, execution centres. Equally, they did the same thing with the schools, basically turned them into military centres, torture centres, prisons, Sharia court. So what this boy is explaining is that this centre, which was a kindergarten school, as you can see from the images on the wall, was converted into a shared White Helmet Nusra Front Al-Qaeda centre, and this particular room we were standing in was used for both torture and for executions. He was not the only one to explain this fact. This was testimony that we received from pretty much every district of East Aleppo while we were there. As I said, I'm going to focus on one story that I recently investigated in East Aleppo during my time there in July this year. The White Helmet Productions made probably one of their most iconic narratives, or created one of their most iconic narratives, on the 30th of November 2016 in Aleppo, which was disseminated immediately by corporate media in the West without investigation and of course with great eagerness to claim Russia in Syria did it. I quote from Lizzie Dearden for The Independent: "Harrowing footage published by the White Helmets Volunteer Rescue Group showed a street littered with corpses and body parts after civilians fleeing eastern Aleppo were reportedly hit by regime artillery fire. Shoes, clothing, suitcases and bags could be seen among the puddles of blood and flesh." Unquote. So a very dramatic leading paragraph from Lizzie Dearden for The Independent. This version of the news in The Independent regarding an alleged Syrian regime massacre in one district of East Aleppo during November 2016 was repeated almost verbatim by NATO-aligned media outlets worldwide. Reports that saturated corporate media in the West, however, fell far short of the harrowing reality as recounted to me by residents of this East Aleppo district in July of this year, a reality that shattered the saccharine white helmet hero narrative being promulgated by Western media. Quote, "The bodies of the dead and dying were left unattended for 10 hours in the street after the Nusra Front rocket attack that killed 15 civilians. The White Helmets did not help them. They stole their belongings." Unquote. Salahuddin Azazi, resident of Jebel Koubeh, an eyewitness to events on the 30th of November 2016. At the time, Jon Snow of Channel 4 stepped up to the plate and performed perhaps one of the landmark Goebbelsesque interviews of the Syrian conflict with Faraz Shahabi. Shahabi is an independent Aleppo MP and head of the Aleppo Chamber of Commerce. Unlike many of his colleagues, Shahabi remained in Aleppo throughout the 5-year East Aleppo occupation by US coalition armed and funded extremist brigades. In his eagerness to discredit the Syrian government and the Syrian Arab Army, Snow did get a bit confused over his facts. Initially endorsing the barrel bomb narrative, he then deftly switched to Syrian artillery fire. Nowhere in his repertoire did he include the analysis that the neighborhood of Jebel Koubeh would be a mountain of rubble, had it been double whammied by the 7 to 9 Richter scale barrel bombs as they are described by the media, and Syrian artillery. Why should a little reality get in the way of producing news desk fantasy, after all, especially when UK foreign policy interests are at stake? He goes on to accuse Faraz Shahabi, who at that time was actually organizing the various humanitarian corridors to enable civilians to leave East Aleppo safely during the battles for liberation. He claims, "You are an MP for Aleppo, your own constituents are dying from your own air force, and you don't do anything about it." Facts on the ground, however, were very different. Basically what you're seeing is the street still standing despite Jon Snow's claims that it had been double whammied by Syrian Air Force and by Syrian artillery. In reality, if you come to the street from this direction, both mortar attacks, which you can see in the side of the Aleppo Council and further up the road in the adjacent buildings, were on the western side of the street. So the mortars had to come from the east. The only artillery centre to the east was the occupied eye hospital, occupied by Al-Qaeda. All civilian testimony also told us after 4.5 years, they were very familiar with the sound of the launch of the various mortars and rockets and the amount of time it took before it landed. And they said they could almost determine exactly where these missiles came from. The closest Syrian Arab Army artillery centre at that point was in the Citadel and in Hanano. Both of those were over 2 kilometres away and to the west of the street and to the north of the street. So simple elimination means that the trajectory, those missiles could not have come from Syrian Arab Army at that point. The eye hospital was only liberated on the 4th of December, so 4 days after this story was produced by the White Helmets. Added to which, the witness testimony told us that basically what had been happening, the Syrian army had created a humanitarian corridor running through these various districts to get to the crossing point into West Aleppo. Over 2,000 civilians on that day had gathered together their belongings and had en masse headed for the Sharuk crossing point. Nusra Front were stationed at the end of this road. They turned them back. They told them to go to Bustan al-Qasr, which was right on the front lines with the Syrian army and Nusra Front. As they turned back, Nusra Front also kettled them from the other end. So basically, Al-Qaeda at this point had kettled these civilians into this street. The missiles were then fired by Nusra Front from the eye hospital into the crowds of civilians. Those that managed to escape were prevented from coming back to collect their dead and dying relatives. Those dead and dying relatives, again, according to testimony of their own families, were left for 10 hours in the freezing, wet conditions of this November day in 2016. While they were on the street, dying, dead, the white helmets were moving among the bodies and stealing their property and stealing their belongings. So that is the fact from on the ground, that corporate media in the West made no attempt to investigate, to inquire about, despite the fact that at the time, officials in Syria and civilians in Syria were actually telling them that this is what had happened. I leave you, regarding this organization, with one glimpse into the real world of the White Helmets. Mohammed Junaid, a White Helmet by day and Nusra Front by night, as opposed to the Hollywood fantasy world that is promoted in the West, and, unfortunately, in the last few days in Ireland, where they were given the Tipperary Peace Prize by Martin Quinn, which was awarded to them on Wednesday, and Ivana Bacik, is that how I pronounce that? Sorry. The Labour senator for Dublin University, who planted trees with Al-Qaeda at Traitors Gate on Thursday. Drawing to the end, I'd like to just show two maps that clearly show Russia's benefit to Syria in their authentic war against terror as compared to the US coalition war of terror. Russia's role in Syria was most recently and resoundingly vindicated by the Syrian Arab Army liberation. Sorry, I'll just go back to that. That was the end of September 2015, just before Russia intervened. Basically, the yellow areas are the Kurdish-held areas, the green are the so-called moderate rebels, which are dominated by Nusra Front, are dominated by Al-Qaeda, and the big green area at the top is actually Idlib, where the majority of Al-Qaeda extremists have been evacuated to when areas in the red government-held areas have been liberated. Under the Syrian government Amnesty and Reconciliation Agreement, those armed fighters, if they are Syrian, are given amnesty to be able to leave with their families and their arms to Idlib, to Turkey, or to Jarablus, which is right on the border with Turkey. So that green area at the top is that's basically holding now the majority of the Al-Qaeda, both mercenaries and Syrian extremist fighters inside Syria. But this basically was when Russia intervened, so in September 2015. This entire area, this whole desert area, was pretty much then under the control of ISIS that purportedly the states had been waging a war against. Unfortunately, under the US war against ISIS, they actually flourished and they expanded. At the end of June 2017, I mean, it's very clear. The Syrian Arab Army has been able to make huge advances, particularly into the desert area, and to liberate areas there, like Palmyra, for example, and areas of Hama, in between Homs and Aleppo, that were under control of ISIS. But Russia's role in Syria was most recently and resoundingly vindicated by the Syrian Arab Army liberation of Deir ez-Zor, a desert city here, in the center of Syria that has been under brutal ISIS siege for 3 years, and before that had been attacked and occupied by a variety of the US coalition-funded and armed extremist groups. Russia, a few days ago, fired a naval cruise missile into the ISIS stronghold in that area, which was packed full of ammunition, equipment, and explosives, by the way, in order to drive a channel through the terrorist lines that enabled the Syrian Arab army to enter and liberate Deir ez-Zor. Of course, corporate media has scathingly covered this momentous victory for the Syrian army and its allies against international terrorism. But this liberation broke the back of the regime change movement, and it has thrown NATO states into disarray. Andrew Korybiko, an author, geopolitical analyst and friend, said this about the new Cold War that has been getting hotter as Syria advances inexorably towards military victory inside Syria. Quote, "The old Cold War saw the US attempting to justify its support to the Mujahideen on the basis that the USSR would move into the Mideast if it wasn't stopped in Afghanistan. Likewise, the new Cold War sees the US arguing once more that Russia is on the verge of controlling the Mideast, but this time if it's not stopped in Syria. The point is to draw tried and tested tropes to make people reflexively think back to the anti-Russian antagonism of the old Cold War. Then there's the politicized issue of the Western conception of human rights. But just as the USSR in US media narrative rolled into Hungary and Czechoslovakia, so too the narrative goes did it land in Syria to stop the democratic freedom fighters right before their great victory. Here the narrative is that Russia always interferes to stop democracy and props up dictatorships, once more hearkening back to the old Cold War stereotypes that people instinctively react upon. Finally, the media has framed Syria as a proxy conflict between Russia and the United States, and this angle is accurate, but they're exploiting America's defeat here to justify more aggressive anti-Russian measures elsewhere, sanctions, diplomatic facility closures, NATO in Eastern Europe, etc. Just as they took advantage of the US 1970s proxy war defeats in Angola, Ethiopia, and Nicaragua to eventually push forth the Reagan Doctrine, in view of this, the Trump Doctrine is nothing short of a neo-Reagan doctrine, end quote. As William Blum noted in Rogue State, the engine of American foreign policy has typically been fueled not by a devotion to any kind of morality, nor even simple decency, but rather by the necessity to serve other masters, which can be broken down into three. One, the care and feeding of American corporations, making the world open and hospitable for neoliberal globalization. Enhancing the financial statements of defense contractors who have contributed generously to members of Congress and residents of the White House. 2, preventing the rise of any society that might serve as a successful example of an alternative to the capitalist model. 3, expanding the empire, establishing political, economic, and military hegemony over as much of the globe as possible, to facilitate the first two imperatives and to prevent the ascendancy of any regional power that will challenge American supremacy, unquote. Syria has effectively confounded the might of empire and has derailed the US neoconservative ambitions in the region, whose greatest beneficiary is Israel. It has suffered greatly in the process, and the courageous Syrian people, who have lost their lives defending their homelands against US hegemony, cunningly disguised as sanctioned terrorism, should never be forgotten, and should always be honoured for their valiant stand that they are taking against the disproportionate force of more than 90 UN member states, their media, and their soft power cohorts. Dr. Butaina Shaban, political and media advisor to the Syrian president, wrote the following after President Putin's meeting with Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, "Today, we are in a time in which Zionist tools are collapsing in Syria and Iraq, and the leaders of the Zionist entity are trembling because the unjust war they waged alongside their Saudi mercenaries against our peoples has only made our armies and our resistance stronger and more competent. So what can our enemies do? May God have mercy on the souls of our martyred young men who gave their lives for this nation. And we pray for the wounded, for all of them have given their blood to serve this noble cause, and the cause of all Arabs and Muslims, the cause of Palestine and the occupied land, and the rights of our people to live freely on our lands." Unquote. Real power comes from two places. The first is force, which depends upon being feared. A nation built by force can only maintain its invulnerability by ensuring the vulnerability of other nations. The second is trust, and a nation that builds its reputation upon trust is the more powerful of the two. The US has a history of supremacy and dishonesty, and has globally lost trust. Russia, through its superior diplomacy and disciplined legitimate military intervention in Syria, has earned international trust as an honest broker of international affairs. And therefore, in my opinion, we're seeing a changing paradigm in geopolitics and a major global power shift. The US vision of a unipolar world is disappearing fast. The almost 7-year conflict in Syria has exposed the weaknesses in the NATO state intervention policy and hybrid war strategy. Syria has resisted a criminal proxy invasion of its sovereign territory and has defended the right of its people to determine their own future without foreign meddling, and it is winning. The Mockingbird corporate media has been exposed to be nothing more than an echo chamber for the NATO member state neocolonialists and Gulf state despots and extremists. And as a result, we're seeing the emergence of this new Cold War and its accompanying anti-Russia propaganda campaigns. A fragile rebalancing is in the process of establishing itself in our world, and we face the prospect of either a better, more internationally cooperative future, or the potential of a devastating Third World War. Thank you.